Sometimes the deepest wounds come from being forgotten, not from being hurt. 4 identical sisters stood alone in the town square, holding hands like their very lives depended on it. Their parents had died of fever, leaving behind quadruplets with nowhere to go. The townspeople of Cedar Ridge walked past them, shaking their heads. Who wants 4 girls to feed and clothe? Boone Riker, the richest cattleman in the territory, watched from his horse. He had silver in his beard and gold in his pocket, but his heart had been cold since losing his own daughter years back. Something about these girls stirred him, though. Maybe it was how they protected each other, or how they stood proud despite having nothing. When nobody else stepped forward, Boone got down from his saddle and knelt before them. He had no idea that taking them home would change everything. Could a broken man learn to be a father again? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wagon wheels creaked against the hard-packed earth as Boone Riker guided his team of horses along the winding trail toward his ranch. Behind him, 4 small figures huddled together on a bed of hay, their worn calico dresses a stark reminder of the poverty they'd known. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Montana landscape, painting the rolling hills in shades of amber and gold. Rose, Lily, Violet, and Iris, names the orphanage matron had given them based on their birth order, though telling them apart required more than a casual glance. They shared the same chestnut hair, the same green eyes, the same delicate features that spoke of their Irish heritage. But each carried herself differently, and it was these subtle differences that caught Boone's attention as he stole glances over his shoulder. Rose, the eldest by mere minutes, sat with her back straight and her chin lifted, as if daring the world to break her spirit. She kept her sisters close, one arm around Lily, who trembled despite the warmth of the day. Violet fidgeted with the frayed hem of her dress, her eyes darting everywhere at once, while Iris simply stared at the horizon with an expression far too old for her 12 years. "How much farther, mister?" Violet's voice carried a slight tremor, though she tried to sound brave. "Not far now," Boone replied, his voice gruff but gentle. "Just over that ridge, you'll see the prettiest valley in all of Montana." As they crested the hill, the Riker ranch spread out before them like something from a dream. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built from local stone and timber, with a wraparound porch that seemed to welcome visitors with open arms. Corrals and outbuildings dotted the landscape, and in the distance, hundreds of cattle grazed peacefully in the golden light. "Lord Almighty," Lily whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "This is where you'll be living," Boone said, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the house. "I know it might seem mighty big after what you're used to, but a house this size needs people to fill it up proper." The front door opened, and a weathered woman in her 50s emerged, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted apron. Martha Caldwell had been Boone's cook and housekeeper for the better part of 15 years, ever since his wife Sarah had passed. She had graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun, and eyes that missed nothing. "Well, I'll be," Martha said, her hands on her hips as she studied the 4 girls. "Boone Riker, what in tarnation have you gone and done?" "I've brought home some daughters," Boone said simply, climbing down from the wagon. He turned to help the girls down, his large hands gentle as he lifted each one to the ground. Martha's expression softened despite herself. She'd seen the loneliness in Boone's eyes every day for the past 8 years, ever since fever took his wife and young daughter. The man had built walls around his heart so high that she'd begun to wonder if he'd ever let anyone climb them again. "Well, don't just stand there gawking," she said, though her tone held more warmth than scolding. "Come on inside. I've got stew on the stove, and by the looks of you girls, you could use a good meal." The inside of the house was even more impressive than the exterior. A grand staircase dominated the entry hall, its banister carved from rich mahogany. Paintings lined the walls, landscapes mostly, though Boone's eyes lingered on one particular portrait of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, holding a small girl with dark ringlets. "That's Sarah," Boone said quietly, noticing Rose's gaze on the painting. "My wife, and that little one there is Emma, my daughter." They both passed on when the fever came through 8 years back. The girls fell silent, understanding instinctively that they stood in a house built for love but emptied by loss. The realization that they weren't the only ones who'd been left behind created an immediate bond between them and this gruff, gentle man who'd chosen to save them. Martha bustled about, setting places at the long dining table that could easily seat 12. "I suppose you girls will need proper rooms," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "The guest rooms have been closed up for years, but they'll clean up nice with some elbow grease and fresh linens." "We can share," Rose spoke up for the first time since leaving town. "We're used to it." "Nonsense," Boone said firmly. "This house has 6 bedrooms sitting empty. Each of you deserves your own space, your own place to call home." As they ate Martha's hearty beef stew, the girls gradually relaxed. Boone asked gentle questions about their lives before the orphanage, learning that their parents had been Irish immigrants who'd tried their hand at farming before the fever claimed them. The girls had been on their own for nearly 3 months before the authorities found them and placed them in the overcrowded orphanage in Cedar Ridge. "What about you?" Iris asked suddenly, her young voice carrying a maturity beyond her years. "Why did you take us in?" "The other folks in town, they looked at us like we were nothing but trouble." Boone set down his spoon and considered his words carefully. These girls had been through enough dishonesty and false promises to last a lifetime. They deserved the truth. "Because I know what it's like to lose everything," he said finally. "And I know what it's like to have a house full of empty rooms and memories that echo off the walls. Maybe we can help each other fill up some of that emptiness." After dinner, Boone showed them through the house. The library contained hundreds of books, their leather spines gleaming in the lamplight. The parlor held a piano that hadn't been touched in years, its keys yellowed but still in tune. Each bedroom was decorated differently, one in soft blues and whites, another in warm yellows, a third in gentle greens, and the fourth in rich purples. "You can choose whichever one speaks to you," Boone told them. "No need to decide tonight. Take your time getting to know the place." As the girls explored, chattering excitedly about details like the clawfoot bathtubs and the window seats with cushioned benches, Boone found himself in his study, staring at a silver locket he kept in his desk drawer. Inside was a miniature portrait of Emma, painted just months before she died. Her smile seemed to encourage him, as if she approved of his decision to fill her home with the laughter of children once again. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression thoughtful. "You sure about this, Boone? 4 girls is a mighty big responsibility, especially ones who've been through what they have." "I'm sure," he replied, closing the locket gently. "For the first time in 8 years, Martha, I'm absolutely certain about something." Later that evening, as the house settled into quiet, Boone walked the halls checking on his new charges. He found Lily asleep in the blue room, curled up like a kitten in the center of the large bed. Violet had chosen the yellow room and was sitting by the window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Iris was in the green room, already fast asleep with one of his books clutched to her chest, but it was Rose who gave him pause. She'd chosen the purple room, the one that had been intended for Emma, though he'd never told anyone that. She was awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, and when she saw him in the doorway, she didn't look away. "Thank you," she said simply. "Not just for the room or the food, for seeing us, for caring enough to stop." Something shifted in Boone's chest, a warmth he hadn't felt in years. This quiet, fierce girl with her protective spirit and old soul was awakening feelings he'd thought buried forever. Not romantic feelings. She was just a child, after all, but something deeper. The capacity to love, to hope, to believe that second chances were possible even for broken men like himself. "You don't need to thank me," he said softly. "We're family now. That's what families do. They take care of each other." As he closed her door and made his way to his own room, Boone Riker realized that for the first time since Sarah and Emma died, he was looking forward to tomorrow. The house that had been a mausoleum for 8 years was finally ready to become a home again. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the valley, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings and the hope that sometimes, when you think you're saving someone else, you end up saving yourself. 3 weeks had passed since the girls arrived at the Riker ranch, and the transformation was remarkable. The house that had stood silent for so long now rang with laughter and the patter of small feet on hardwood floors. Rose had proven herself a natural with the horses, spending hours in the stables learning to brush and feed them. Lily showed a gift for cooking, working alongside Martha to prepare meals that filled the dining room with warmth and wonderful aromas. Violet had claimed the library as her domain, devouring books with an appetite that impressed even Boone. And Iris had discovered a love for the garden, coaxing flowers and vegetables from the rich Montana soil with the patience of someone twice her age. Boone found himself whistling as he worked for the first time in years. The ranch hands had noticed the change in their boss. Jake Morrison, his foreman for the past decade, commented that it was like watching a man come back to life. Even the cattle seemed to sense the shift, grazing more peacefully and producing more milk than they had in seasons past. It was a Tuesday morning when the girls were helping Martha hang laundry on the line behind the house that trouble arrived. Boone was in the barn shoeing one of his prize mares when Jake came running, his face grim and his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Boss, we got company," Jake said, his voice tight with concern. "3 riders coming up the main trail, and they don't look like they're here for a social call." Boone set down his tools and wiped his hands on a cloth, his instincts already telling him this wasn't good news. He'd lived in the territory long enough to read the signs. The way the riders sat their horses, the deliberate pace of their approach, the fact that they'd chosen to arrive when most of the ranch hands were out with the cattle. "Girls," he called toward the house, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect throughout the valley. "Come inside, now." The urgency in his tone sent them scurrying toward the kitchen door, Martha herding them like a protective mother hen. Boone walked to the front of the house, Jake flanking him, and waited as the 3 horsemen approached. The leader was a man Boone recognized, but had hoped never to see again. Cyrus Blackwood, owner of the largest textile mill in the territory, and a man whose reputation for cruelty was matched only by his hunger for profit. He was thin as a rail, with pale skin that spoke of too much time indoors and eyes like chips of coal. His companions were hired muscle, the kind of men who solved problems with fists and bullets rather than words. "Boone Riker," Blackwood said as he dismounted, his voice carrying the false politeness of a snake oil salesman. "I hear congratulations are in order. Word is you've taken in some orphan children." "Word travels fast," Boone replied evenly, though his hand drifted instinctively toward his gun belt. "What brings you to my ranch, Blackwood?" From his coat pocket, Blackwood produced a folded document sealed with official wax. "Legal papers, I'm afraid. It seems those 4 girls you've so generously rescued actually belong to me. I'm their legal guardian, appointed by the court in Denver." The words hit Boone like a physical blow. He took the papers with hands that remained steady through sheer force of will and scanned the official language. It looked legitimate enough. Stamps, signatures, legal terminology that seemed to give Blackwood claim to the girls as their nearest living relative. "Nearest relative?" Boone questioned, his voice growing dangerous. "These girls told me they had no family left. Distant cousin on their father's side," Blackwood explained with a smile that never reached his eyes. "I was traveling when the tragic news reached me, or I would have claimed them sooner. Imagine my surprise when I learned they'd been taken in by the famous Boone Riker instead of being properly placed in my care. Through the kitchen window, Boone could see 4 small faces pressed against the glass, their eyes wide with fear. The terror he saw there, especially in Rose's face, told him everything he needed to know about Cyrus Blackwood's version of guardianship. "And what exactly does your guardianship entail?" Boone asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I own several textile operations," Blackwood replied smoothly. "The girls would be provided with housing, meals, and valuable skills in the industrial arts. They'd be contributing members of society rather than burdens on a lonely rancher's charity. Child labor." Boone had heard the stories about Blackwood's mills. Children working 14-hour days in dangerous conditions, sleeping in overcrowded dormitories, paid in scraps and treated like property. The thought of Rose, Lily, Violet, and Iris in such a place made his blood run cold. "I don't think so," Boone said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. Blackwood's false smile faded, replaced by something much uglier. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter, Riker. These are legal documents, signed by a federal judge. If you interfere with my rightful claim to these children, you'll be guilty of kidnapping. And if you try to take them from my property," Boone replied, his hand now resting openly on his gun, "you'll be guilty of trespassing. Jake, would you mind showing these gentlemen the way back to the main road?" For a moment, tension crackled in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. Blackwood's hired guns shifted nervously in their saddles, recognizing the reputation of the man they faced. Boone Riker wasn't just wealthy, he was dangerous when cornered, and he had enough influence in the territory to make life very difficult for anyone who crossed him. "This isn't over, Riker," Blackwood said as he remounted his horse. "I'll be back with federal marshals if necessary. Those girls belong to me, and I always collect what's mine." As the 3 riders departed, Boone remained standing on his porch until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he allow the girls to come outside, and the moment they did, Rose ran straight to him and buried her face against his chest. "Please don't let him take us," she whispered, her voice muffled by his shirt. "We've heard about his mills. Children go in and they never come out the same. Some don't come out at all." Boone wrapped his arms around her, feeling the tremors that ran through her small frame. Over her head, he could see her sisters watching with the same desperate hope and terror. They'd found safety and love in his home, and now that sanctuary was threatened by a man who saw them as nothing more than free labor. "I won't let him hurt you," Boone promised, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I don't care what papers he has or what judges he knows. You're my daughters now, and I protect what's mine." That evening, as the girls huddled together in Rose's room for comfort, Boone sat in his study with Jake and Martha, planning their next move. The legal papers might be legitimate, but Boone had resources of his own. Lawyers in Denver, friends in the territorial government, and enough money to fight any court battle Blackwood might wage. But as he stared at the threatening letter Blackwood had left behind, a formal notice giving him 48 hours to surrender the girls, Boone realized this fight would test everything he'd rebuilt over the past 3 weeks. The question wasn't whether he could win, but whether he was willing to risk everything, including his own freedom, to protect 4 orphaned girls who'd already suffered more than any children should. Looking at the silver locket on his desk, at Emma's sweet face smiling up at him from the miniature portrait, Boone knew the answer. Some things were worth fighting for, and sometimes the most important battles were the ones that mattered most to the heart. The morning after Blackwood's visit dawned gray and heavy with the promise of rain. Boone hadn't slept more than an hour, spending the night pacing his study and drafting telegrams to every lawyer and political contact he could think of in Denver and beyond. The threatening letter lay open on his desk like a coiled snake, its formal language masking the very real danger it represented. Martha found him there at dawn, still fully dressed and surrounded by crumpled papers. "You need coffee and breakfast," she said firmly, setting down a steaming cup. "And those girls need to see that you're not giving up on them." "I'm not," Boone replied, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. "But Martha, what if those papers are legitimate? What if some judge really did appoint Blackwood as their guardian?" "Then we'll fight it in court," Martha said with the fierce determination of a woman who'd helped raise his daughter. "You've got more money and influence than that snake ever will. Besides, any judge with sense would see that those girls are better off here than in some factory." The sound of small footsteps on the stairs interrupted them. Rose appeared in the doorway, already dressed in the simple blue dress Boone had bought for her in town. Her hair was braided neatly, but her eyes showed the sleepless night she'd endured. "Mr. Riker," she said formally, and something about the way she'd returned to calling him that instead of the more familiar Boone she'd recently adopted cut him deeply. "My sisters and I have been talking. We know we've brought trouble to your house, and we don't want to be a burden. If we left on our own—" "Stop right there," Boone interrupted, rising from his chair so quickly that it scraped against the floor. "You're not going anywhere, and you're not a burden. You're family." Rose's composure cracked slightly, revealing the frightened 12-year-old beneath her brave facade. "But what if he comes back with those marshals? What if they make you give us up anyway?" Boone knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. The family Bible sat open on a nearby table, and tucked between its pages was a faded yellow ribbon, one that had belonged to Emma. Seeing it gave him strength, a reminder that some bonds transcend law and blood. "Rose, listen to me carefully. I've been alone in this house for 8 years, and I thought that's how I was meant to stay. But you and your sisters brought life back into these walls. You brought joy back into my heart. Do you really think I'd let anyone take that away without the fight of my life?" Before Rose could answer, Jake burst through the front door, his hat still dripping from the rain that had finally begun to fall. "Boss, we got bigger problems than just Blackwood. Word's spreading through town about the legal papers. Some folks are saying maybe the girls do belong with their rightful guardian. Others are saying you're harboring runaways." The implications hit Boone like a physical blow. In a small frontier town, reputation mattered more than money sometimes. If enough people believed he was in the wrong, it could affect his business relationships, his standing in the community, even his ability to hire good ranch hands. "What about Sheriff Morrison?" Boone asked. Jake's brother held the law in Cedar Ridge, and while he was an honest man, he was also bound by federal warrants if Blackwood really did have them. "That's the thing," Jake said, removing his hat and running a hand through his wet hair. "Deputy Wilson was asking questions yesterday about whether you'd filed any adoption papers. Seems like someone's been putting ideas in their heads about your legal standing with the girls." Martha's face darkened. "That weasel Blackwood's been busy, hasn't he? Spreading poison in town while making his legal threats here." As if summoned by their conversation, Lily, Violet, and Iris appeared on the stairs, their faces pale with worry. They'd clearly been listening, and the fear in their eyes reminded Boone painfully of Emma during her final days, when she'd sensed that something terrible was happening even though the adults tried to protect her from the truth. "Girls," Boone said, straightening to his full height and forcing confidence into his voice, "I want you to pack a bag with your most important belongings. We're going to Denver." "Denver," Rose echoed, hope and confusion warring in her expression. "I'm taking you to see Judge Harrison, an old friend of mine," Boone explained. "If Blackwood has legal papers, then we need legal papers of our own. I'm going to formally adopt all 4 of you, make it official that you're my daughters." The transformation in the girls' faces was immediate and profound. For the first time since Blackwood's visit, they looked like children again instead of refugees preparing to flee. "You mean it?" Violet whispered, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. "You really want to adopt us?" "I've never meant anything more in my life," Boone assured her. Within 2 hours, they were loaded into Boone's best carriage, Jake driving while Martha sat with the girls to keep them calm during the long journey. Boone rode alongside on horseback, his rifle in its saddle holster and his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. The rain had intensified, turning the usually dusty trail into a muddy challenge that slowed their progress. As they made their way toward the territorial capital, Rose sat quietly beside the carriage window, watching the countryside pass by. The yellow ribbon from Emma's Bible was now tied around her wrist. Boone had given it to her that morning, telling her it belonged to someone very special who would have loved having sisters to share her father's affection. "Mr. Riker," she called softly through the rain. "Yes, Rose?" "When we get to Denver, and if the judge says yes to the adoption, what should we call you then?" Boone's throat tightened with emotion. These brave girls, who'd lost everything once already, were daring to hope for a real family again. The courage that required humbled him completely. "Well," he said, his voice carrying despite the rain, "I reckon daughters usually call their fathers Pa or Papa if they've a mind to." The smile that spread across Rose's face was brighter than sunshine, and when she shared the news with her sisters, their delighted squeals echoed across the prairie like a song of pure joy. But even as happiness filled the carriage, Boone kept his eyes on the trail behind them. He'd spotted riders following at a distance for the past hour, too far away to identify but close enough to be a threat. Blackwood wasn't the type of man to wait patiently for legal proceedings, and Boone had a growing suspicion that their race to Denver was about to become much more dangerous. The yellow ribbon fluttered from Rose's wrist like a banner of hope, but Boone knew that hope alone wouldn't be enough to protect his newfound family. The real test was still ahead of them, and everything he'd built with these girls hung in the balance of what would happen in the territorial capital. Denver loomed before them as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, the territorial capital's buildings rising from the plains like a promise of civilization in the vast wilderness. The journey had taken longer than expected due to the muddy roads, and Boone's concern about their followers had only grown stronger. 3 times during the afternoon, he'd spotted the same group of riders maintaining their distance, close enough to track but far enough to avoid confrontation. Judge Harrison's office was located in the territorial courthouse, an imposing brick structure that dominated the center of town. As they pulled up to the building, Boone felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Samuel Harrison had been a friend since before Sarah died, a fair man who'd helped Boone navigate the legal complexities of expanding his ranch holdings over the years. If anyone could cut through Blackwood's legal maneuvering, it would be Sam. The girls huddled close to Martha as they climbed the courthouse steps, their earlier excitement tempered by the intimidating atmosphere of territorial justice. Legal matters in Denver could make or break families with the stroke of a pen, and even young children understood the weight of what they were attempting. "Judge Harrison will see you immediately," the clerk announced after Boone sent in his calling card. The speed of the response spoke to both his influence and the urgency of their situation. Samuel Harrison was a large man with kind eyes and a graying beard that spoke of wisdom earned through years of difficult decisions. His chambers were lined with law books and territorial maps, but what drew the girls' attention was a collection of small wooden toys on his desk, mementos from cases involving children over the years. "Boone," the judge said warmly, rising from his chair, "when I received your telegram this morning, I cleared my afternoon schedule. These must be the young ladies in question." The girls stood quietly as introductions were made, their best manners on display despite their nervousness. Judge Harrison had a gift for putting children at ease, asking gentle questions about their journey and their new life at the ranch, while simultaneously assessing their well-being with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many cases of child mistreatment. "Now then," Harrison said once everyone was seated, "I've reviewed the documents your Mr. Blackwood filed yesterday. They appear legitimate on the surface, but there are several concerning elements that warrant closer examination. Yesterday? Boone interrupted, his blood running cold. He filed papers yesterday, but he only showed them to me the day before. Harrison's expression grew grim. Mr. Blackwood has been quite busy, it seems. He filed a formal claim of guardianship, a petition to remove the children from your custody, and most troubling, a complaint alleging that you've been harboring runaways from their rightful guardian. The implications were staggering. If Blackwood had been planning this for longer than he'd let on, it meant he'd known about the girls before Boone ever took them in. It meant the entire scenario at the town square might have been orchestrated to create the legal mess they now faced. There's more, Harrison continued, pulling out a leather portfolio that Boone recognized as containing a family Bible and various personal documents. I had my clerk research the genealogical claims Mr. Blackwood is making. While there is indeed a distant familial connection through the girl's father's line, it's so remote as to be practically meaningless. More importantly, there are questions about the legitimacy of some of these documents. Rose leaned forward in her chair, her young voice carrying surprising strength. Judge Harrison, sir, what would happen to us if we had to go with Mr. Blackwood? The judge's expression softened as he looked at her. My dear, that's precisely what we're here to prevent. Mr. Riker has petitioned for formal adoption, which would supersede any claims of distant relatives. The question is whether we can expedite the process before Mr. Blackwood returns with federal marshals. How long would that take? Martha asked, her protective instincts evident in every word. Under normal circumstances, several weeks for a proper investigation and waiting period. However, Harrison paused, reaching for a special seal and document. Given the urgent circumstances and the clear evidence of the children's well-being in your care, I can issue emergency guardianship papers immediately. This would give you legal standing while we pursue full adoption proceedings. Hope flickered in Boone's chest, but years of experience had taught him to be cautious. What's the catch, Sam? The emergency guardianship requires testimony from the children themselves, stating their preference for placement. Given their age, the court needs to hear directly from them that they wish to remain in your care rather than be placed with their supposed relative. One by one, the girls spoke with quiet dignity about their life at the ranch, their gratitude for Boone's care, and their fear of what awaited them in Blackwood's textile mills. Violet, usually the most timid, surprised everyone by speaking up clearly about the stories they'd heard from other orphans who disappeared into factory work. Mr. Riker reads to us every night, Iris said, her small voice carrying in the quiet chambers. He taught me about flowers and how to make things grow. Mr. Blackwood just wants us to work machines until we're too tired to remember our own names. As the afternoon wore on, Harrison prepared the emergency guardianship documents with meticulous care. Each page was signed, witnessed, and sealed with the authority of the territorial court. When he finally handed the completed papers to Boone, the weight of them felt like a shield against the storm that was coming. These papers give you legal authority over the girls' welfare and placement, Harrison explained. However, I must warn you that if Mr. Blackwood has truly obtained federal support for his claim, this may only be a temporary protection. We need to move quickly on the full adoption proceedings. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Harrison pulled Boone aside for a private word. There's something else you should know. My clerk discovered that Mr. Blackwood has been acquiring custody of orphan children throughout the territory for the past 2 years. Always distant relatives, always through legal channels, and always children who disappear into his industrial operations. These girls aren't his first victims. The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow. Blackwood wasn't just a cruel businessman. He was running a systematic operation to acquire child labor under the guise of legal guardianship. The thought that other children had already fallen into his trap, with no one to protect them, made Boone's resolve burn even hotter. We'll stop him, Sam, Boone said quietly, his hand resting on the legal documents that now protected his daughters. And maybe we can help some of those other children while we're at it. As they left the courthouse, the late afternoon sun painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The girls walked closer to Boone now, the emergency guardianship papers giving them a sense of security they hadn't felt since Blackwood's first visit. But even as they celebrated this legal victory, none of them noticed the three riders watching from the shadows across the street, or the way those riders turned their horses north toward Cedar Ridge the moment the courthouse doors closed behind the Riker family. The return journey to the ranch should have been a celebration, but Boone's instincts kept him alert as they made their way through the Montana wilderness. The emergency guardianship papers were safely tucked inside his coat pocket, but something felt wrong about the way their shadows seemed to shift and move behind them on the trail. Jake had taken point on horseback, while Boone rode alongside the carriage, both men keeping their rifles close at hand. "Pa," Rose called softly from inside the carriage, and the word still sent a warm shock through Boone's chest every time she said it. "Are we really safe now, with the papers and all?" "Safer than we were this morning," Boone replied honestly. He'd never lied to his daughters about the realities they faced, and he wouldn't start now. "But we need to stay careful until the full adoption goes through. Judge Harrison is working on that, and he's a good man." The truth was more complicated than he could explain to a 12-year-old. The emergency guardianship was a powerful legal tool, but it could be challenged if Blackwood truly had federal backing. Worse, it didn't protect them from extra-legal threats. Men with guns who cared more about money than court documents. As they crested the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge, the town spread out below them in the gathering dusk. Lamplight flickered in windows like earthbound stars, and smoke rose from chimneys carrying the promise of warm suppers and safe beds. But something was wrong with the picture. Too many people were gathered in the main street, and even from this distance, Boone could see they were agitated. "Jake," Boone called softly. "I see it, boss. That's not a social gathering down there." They approached the outskirts of town cautiously, and as they drew closer, the reason for the crowd became clear. Sheriff Morrison stood on the steps of his office, holding what appeared to be official documents, while Cyrus Blackwood waited beside him with two federal marshals. The crowd was divided, some supporting Boone and others convinced by Blackwood's claims of legal authority. "Federal marshals?" Martha whispered from inside the carriage, her voice tight with worry. "Just like he threatened." Boone's hand moved instinctively to the emergency guardianship papers in his coat. Judge Harrison had warned him this might happen, but seeing it unfold made his blood run cold. Federal marshals carried authority that superseded local law, and if they'd been convinced that Boone was harboring children illegally, those papers might not be enough to protect his family. "What do we do?" Jake asked quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. Before Boone could answer, Rose had climbed out of the carriage and was standing beside his horse. The yellow ribbon around her wrist fluttered in the evening breeze, and her young face was set with determination that reminded him painfully of her mother's courage. "We go down there," she said simply. "We tell them the truth, and we show them the papers. We're not criminals, and we're not going to act like we are." The wisdom of a child sometimes cut straight through adult fears to the heart of what mattered. Boone dismounted and helped his other daughters out of the carriage, then walked with them toward the crowd. Jake and Martha flanked them like guardians, their presence a reminder that this family had allies who would stand with them no matter what came. The crowd parted as they approached, whispers following in their wake. Boone recognized most of the faces. Shopkeepers he'd done business with for years, ranchers who'd worked alongside him during cattle drives, women who'd brought casseroles after Sarah died. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with suspicion, and still others with the uncomfortable expression of people who simply wanted the whole messy situation to disappear. Boone Riker, one of the federal marshals, called out, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "You're under arrest for harboring fugitive minors and interfering with federal custody orders. Now hold on just a minute." Sheriff Morrison interjected, his loyalty to Boone warring with his duty to uphold federal law. "Let's see what papers Mr. Riker has before we start arresting anyone." Boone reached slowly into his coat, making sure both marshals could see his movements, and withdrew the emergency guardianship documents. The legal papers felt like armor in his hands, protection forged in the careful language of territorial law. "Emergency guardianship issued this afternoon by Judge Samuel Harrison in Denver," Boone announced, his voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "These girls are under my legal protection until full adoption proceedings can be completed." Blackwood's face went white, then red with fury. "Those papers are meaningless against federal custody orders." One of the marshals, an older man with gray whiskers and intelligent eyes, stepped forward and examined the documents carefully. His partner, younger and clearly less experienced, kept his hand near his gun as if expecting trouble. "These appear to be in order," the older marshal said after several long minutes. "Judge Harrison's seal and signature, proper witnesses, emergency provisions clearly stated." "But Marshal Crawford," Blackwood protested, "my custody papers predate his by several days." "Your papers claim distant kinship," Crawford replied evenly. "These establish legal guardianship based on the children's welfare and stated preference. In cases where both claims have merit, territorial courts generally favor the children's best interests." From somewhere in the crowd, old Mrs. Henderson spoke up. "I've seen those girls every Sunday at church for 3 weeks now. They're happy, healthy, and well cared for. That's more than I can say for the children from Blackwood's Mills who pass through town." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering, and Boone realized that public opinion was beginning to turn in their favor. People might have been uncertain about the legal complexities, but they could see with their own eyes that the girls were thriving under his care. "Furthermore," Rose said, stepping forward with courage that amazed the adults, around her, "we want to testify about our own wishes. Judge Harrison said we had the right to speak for ourselves." Marshal Crawford crouched down to her level, his expression gentle despite the serious nature of the proceedings. "Young lady, do you understand what's happening here? Do you know what it means to choose your guardian?" "Yes, sir," Rose replied clearly. "It means choosing between a man who reads us stories and teaches us to ride horses, and a man who wants to put us to work in a factory where children get hurt. It means choosing between someone who loves us and someone who sees us as property." The crowd fell silent at her words, the simple truth cutting through all the legal complications and official documents. Even Blackwood seemed momentarily speechless in the face of such direct honesty. But as Marshal Crawford prepared to render his decision, a commotion erupted at the edge of the crowd. More riders were approaching town, and these weren't federal officials or curious townspeople. These were armed men with hard faces and no respect for territorial law, and Boone realized with growing dread that Blackwood had prepared for the possibility that legal channels might fail him. The evening was about to become much more dangerous. The 8 riders who thundered into Cedar Ridge's main street weren't lawmen or concerned citizens. They were gunfighters, hired muscle with worn leather and cold eyes that spoke of violence as their trade. Their leader was a man Boone recognized from wanted posters. Dutch Manning, a notorious outlaw who'd been terrorizing mining camps and small towns throughout the territory for years. Marshal Crawford's hand moved instinctively to his weapon as he assessed the new threat. "This is federal business," he called out to the approaching riders. "Move along." Dutch Manning's laugh was like gravel scraping against stone. "Federal business, is it? Well, Marshal, we're here on private business. Mr. Blackwood has hired us to provide security during this legal proceeding." The crowd began to scatter as the reality of the situation became clear. What had been a tense but civilized discussion of custody rights was rapidly becoming something far more dangerous. Townspeople ducked into doorways and behind wagons, leaving only the principals and a few brave souls standing in the street. "Security." Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his badge gleaming in the lamplight. "In my town, I provide the security. You boys can ride on out the way you came." "Now, Sheriff," Blackwood interjected smoothly, "these gentlemen are merely here to ensure that justice is served and that there's no interference with federal custody orders." Boone felt the familiar weight of his Colt .45 at his hip, but his primary concern wasn't his own safety. It was the 4 girls who stood close behind him, their earlier courage now tempered by very real fear. The yellow ribbon on Rose's wrist trembled as she reached for his hand, and he squeezed her fingers reassuringly while his mind calculated distances and angles. "Pa," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. "What's happening?" "Just stay close to me," Boone murmured, his eyes never leaving Dutch Manning and his men. "Whatever happens, you girls stay behind me and Martha." Jake had positioned himself off to one side with a clear line of sight, his rifle held ready but not yet aimed. Other ranch hands had begun filtering into town, drawn by word of the confrontation, and Boone could see them taking positions around the edges of the square. The loyalty of his men might tip the scales if violence erupted, but it would also guarantee that innocent people got hurt. Marshal Crawford was studying the situation with the practiced eye of a man who'd survived years of frontier law enforcement. His younger partner looked nervous, but determined, clearly out of his depth, but unwilling to back down from his duty. "Mr. Blackwood," Crawford said carefully, "if you have legitimate custody rights, there's no need for hired guns. Federal marshals are quite capable of enforcing court orders without assistance from private contractors." "Of course, Marshal," Blackwood replied, though his pale eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "But you must understand, Mr. Riker has significant resources and influence in this territory. I simply want to ensure that there's no question about who has legal authority here." It was a veiled threat wrapped in legal language, and everyone present understood the subtext. Blackwood was letting them know that he was prepared to use violence if the law didn't give him what he wanted. The emergency guardianship papers that had seemed so powerful in Judge Harrison's chambers now felt fragile as morning frost against the reality of 8 armed men. Rose stepped forward slightly, her young voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Marshal Crawford, sir, may we ask you something?" The older marshal looked down at her with surprise and growing respect. "What is it, young lady? If Mr. Blackwood really cares about what's best for us, why did he bring gunmen instead of teachers or caretakers? If he wants to give us a good home, why does he need to threaten people with violence?" The question hit its mark like a perfectly aimed arrow. Murmurs of agreement rose from the few townspeople still brave enough to remain in the street, and even Dutch Manning's men shifted uncomfortably in their saddles. Children had a way of cutting through adult deceptions to expose uncomfortable truths. "That's an excellent point," Crawford said, his voice growing firmer. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm beginning to question whether your methods here are consistent with the children's best interests." Blackwood's composure finally cracked, revealing the cold fury beneath his civilized facade. "Marshal, I demand that you arrest Mr. Riker immediately for interference with federal custody orders. These men are simply here to ensure my rights are protected." "Your rights?" Martha stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding her fear. "What about their rights? What about the right of children to be safe and loved instead of worked to death in your factories?" The confrontation was reaching a breaking point. Boone could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam boiler, ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Dutch Manning's hand rested casually on his gun butt, and his men were spreading out in a formation that would give them better shooting angles if violence erupted. But it was Violet who broke the deadlock, her quiet voice somehow carrying above the brewing storm. "Mr. Marshal, sir, could we show you something?" From her small bag, she withdrew a piece of cloth, a torn fragment of blue fabric that looked like it might have come from a child's dress. "This belonged to our friend Mary from the orphanage. She was taken by Mr. Blackwood's men 6 months ago, supposed to go work in his mill for good wages and nice rooms." She held up the fabric, and in the lamplight, dark stains were clearly visible. "This is all we ever got back of her. The man who brought it said she had an accident with one of the machines. Said it happens sometimes and we shouldn't ask questions. The silence that followed was deafening. Even Dutch Manning's men looked uncomfortable now, apparently having limits to what they were willing to support. The evidence of Blackwood's true nature, presented with the heartbreaking honesty of a child, was more damning than any legal document. Marshal Crawford's face had gone stone cold, and when he looked at Blackwood now, it was with the expression of a man who had seen enough evil to recognize it instantly. "Mr. Blackwood, I think we need to have a private discussion about your custody claims and your business practices." But Blackwood's mask had finally fallen away completely. "I've wasted enough time on legal niceties," he snarled. "Manning, take the girls. Kill anyone who gets in your way." The words were barely out of his mouth before the evening erupted into violence, gunshots echoing off the buildings as men dove for cover, and the fate of 4 innocent children hung in the balance of frontier justice. The first gunshot shattered the evening air, but it didn't come from Dutch Manning or his hired guns. It came from the church bell tower at the edge of town, where a rifle muzzle flash illuminated a figure that no one had expected to see. "Federal agents, drop your weapon!" The voice that boomed across the square belonged to a woman, and as she descended from the bell tower with military precision, Boone's world tilted on its axis. The woman was tall, confident, and bore a striking resemblance to someone he thought he'd lost forever. "Emma?" Boone whispered, the word barely escaping his lips. But it wasn't Emma. His daughter would still be only 16 if she'd lived. This woman was in her 20s, with the same dark hair and determined jaw, but carrying herself with the authority of someone accustomed to command. She wore the uniform of a federal investigator, complete with badge and credentials that gleamed in the lamplight. "My name is Agent Sarah Catherine Riker," she announced, her rifle trained on Dutch Manning. "I'm with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and I've been tracking Mr. Blackwood's illegal child labor operation for the past 8 months." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of Boone's heart hammering against his ribs seemed loud as thunder. Agent Riker. She'd taken Sarah's name, he realized. The name of the wife he'd lost. Continued speaking with professional calm, even as her presence turned everything he thought he knew upside down. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for operating an illegal child labor ring, human trafficking, conspiracy to commit kidnapping, and accessory to murder in the deaths of at least 14 children in your textile operations." Dutch Manning's men were looking around uncertainly, their hired guns suddenly aimed at what appeared to be a federal agent rather than local law enforcement. The dynamics of the situation had shifted dramatically, and even hardened criminals thought twice before shooting federal officers. "This is impossible," Blackwood stammered, his face going ashen. "Who are you? Where did you come from?" But Boone was staring at the woman's face, seeing familiar features that sent his mind reeling back through years of grief and buried hope. As she approached, keeping her weapon trained on the gunfighters, he noticed a small scar above her left eyebrow, a scar he remembered from the day Emma fell from her pony when she was 7 years old. "Emma," he said again, this time loud enough for others to hear. Agent Riker's professional composure faltered for just a moment, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of love, pain, and years of unresolved questions. "Hello, Pa. I know I've got some explaining to do." Rose, who had been pressed against Boone's side throughout the confrontation, looked between the federal agent and her adoptive father with the quick intelligence that made her special. "Pa, who is this lady? She looks like the painting in the house." "She's my daughter," Boone said, his voice thick with emotion. "My first daughter, the one I thought I'd lost." The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd, but there was no time for emotional reunions. Dutch Manning was calculating odds and angles, his survival instincts warring with his criminal arrogance. Federal agent or not, this woman was outnumbered and isolated. "I don't care if you're the president's daughter," Manning growled, raising his weapon. Blackwood pays better than the government, and dead agents don't testify in court. What happened next demonstrated why Emma, Agent Sarah Catherine Riker, had survived 8 years of thinking her family was dead and risen through the ranks of federal law enforcement. Before Manning could fully draw his gun, she'd put a bullet through his shoulder and rolled behind a nearby water trough, her rifle reloading with practiced efficiency. "Jake, get the girls to cover," Boone shouted, drawing his own weapon as the street erupted into chaos. Gunshots echoed off buildings as Manning's men scattered, seeking protection while returning fire at the federal agent who disrupted their carefully planned operation. Marshal Crawford and his partner had taken positions behind a wagon, their own weapons adding to the firepower directed at Blackwood's hired guns. Sheriff Morrison was coordinating with local men who'd armed themselves, turning the main street of Cedar Ridge into a battlefield where the future of innocent children would be decided with gunpowder and lead. But through the chaos, Emma, he couldn't think of her by any other name, was moving with deadly purpose. Years of federal training had turned the little girl who used to braid her horse's mane into a dangerous opponent for any criminal foolish enough to threaten her family. "Pa," she called over the gunfire. "The girls, are they safe?" "Safe as I can make them," Boone replied, firing at one of Manning's men who was trying to flank their position. "But Emma, how are you alive? The fever—" "Not now, Pa. We'll talk after we finish this." Rose, huddled behind an overturned table with her sisters, was watching the reunion with wide eyes. Even in the middle of a gunfight, she could see the profound emotion on Boone's face as he fought alongside the daughter he'd thought was lost forever. Blackwood, meanwhile, was trying to disappear into the shadows at the edge of the square, apparently having realized that his hired protection was outgunned and outmaneuvered. But Martha had noticed his movement, and the protective cook was having none of it. "Oh, no you don't, you snake!" Martha emerged from cover with a cast-iron skillet in one hand and righteous fury in her eyes. "You're not running away after threatening my girls." The sight of a middle-aged cook charging a wealthy businessman with kitchen implements might have been comical under other circumstances, but Martha's determination was no laughing matter. Blackwood barely managed to duck her first swing, stumbling backward into the path of Agent Riker's approaching arrest. The gunfight was winding down as Manning's remaining men realized they were facing federal agents, local law enforcement, and an entire community that had rallied to protect 4 orphaned children. One by one, they threw down their weapons and raised their hands, their leader already wounded and their employer about to be arrested. As the smoke cleared and the echoes of gunfire faded, Boone found himself standing in the middle of Cedar Ridge's main street, surrounded by his adopted daughters and facing the biological daughter he'd mourned for 8 years. The yellow ribbon on Rose's wrist had torn during the chaos, but she clutched the pieces in her small fist like a talisman. "Pa," Emma said quietly, holstering her weapon and removing her badge. "I know you have questions. I know this is impossible to understand, but first, are you all right? Are the girls safe?" "We're safe," he replied, his voice breaking with 8 years of buried grief and sudden, overwhelming joy. "But Emma, sweetheart, how?" "The fever didn't kill me," she said simply. "It nearly did, but Doc Patterson got me to Denver just in time. I was in a coma for weeks, and when I woke up, they told me you and Ma had died of the same fever. I've been trying to find my way home ever since." The truth was like a landslide, reshaping the landscape of everything Boone had believed about loss, grief, and the possibility of second chances. As federal agents moved to secure the prisoners and townspeople began emerging from their hiding places, one impossible fact remained. His family, broken apart by tragedy and misunderstanding, was finally beginning to heal. The aftermath of the gunfight left Cedar Ridge's main street looking like a war zone, with overturned wagons, broken windows, and the acrid smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. As federal agents secured the prisoners and townspeople emerged from their hiding places, Boone stood frozen in the center of it all, his mind struggling to process the miracle that had just unfolded before his eyes. Emma, Agent Sarah Catherine Riker, was coordinating with other federal agents who seemed to materialize from various hiding spots around town. It became clear that her dramatic appearance hadn't been coincidence, but rather the culmination of a carefully planned operation that had been months in the making. "How long have you been watching us?" Boone asked as she finished giving orders to her team. 3 weeks, Emma replied, her professional mask slipping to reveal the emotional toll of seeing her father after 8 years. "Ever since you took in the girls. We'd been tracking Blackwood's operation, following a pattern of missing orphans throughout the territory. When we learned he was making a move on 4 sisters in Cedar Ridge, I volunteered to take point on the investigation." Rose stepped forward, her young face serious despite the chaos around them. "You've been protecting us this whole time." Emma knelt down to Rose's level, her eyes soft with the same warmth Boone remembered from her childhood. "Yes, sweetheart. My job was to make sure you and your sisters stayed safe while we built our case against the bad men who wanted to hurt you." The revelation that they'd been under federal protection explained several things that had puzzled Boone during recent weeks. Strange noises at night, the feeling of being watched, and the way certain threats had seemed to disappear before they could materialize. Emma and her team had been guardian angels working from the shadows. "But why didn't you tell me?" Boone's voice cracked with 8 years of grief and confusion. "Why did you let me think you were dead?" Emma's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the father she'd thought lost forever. "Because I thought you were dead too, Pa. Doc Patterson told me the fever had taken you and Ma both. When I recovered enough to ask questions, he showed me newspaper clippings about your deaths, funeral notices, even a death certificate." Martha, who had been listening with growing anger, stepped forward with her skillet still in hand. "Doc Patterson told you what? That old fool. Boone, Sarah died of the fever, God rest her soul, but you were never even sick. You were right here, grieving for both of them." The pieces of a cruel deception began falling into place. Doc Patterson, the town's physician during those dark days, had been the one to take Emma to Denver for treatment. He'd also been the one to handle the death certificates and funeral arrangements. For reasons they might never fully understand, he'd lied to a dying child about her family's fate. "He's been dead for 6 years now," Sheriff Morrison said quietly. "Took whatever secrets he had to his grave. But I remember those days. You never left this house except to visit their graves, Boone. You were broken, but very much alive." Emma buried her face in her hands, the weight of 8 years of unnecessary separation crushing down on her. "I've been searching for the truth about my family while working my way through law enforcement training. When this investigation brought me back to Montana, I started asking questions about the fever epidemic. That's when I learned that the death records didn't match the burial records." "What do you mean?" Boone asked, kneeling beside his daughter. "There's a grave marked for Emma Riker in Cedar Ridge Cemetery," Agent Crawford interjected, having overheard the conversation. "But according to the church records Agent Riker uncovered, that grave was never used. Someone wanted people to believe she was dead." The implications were staggering. Someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception that had torn apart a family and left both father and daughter grieving for people who were still alive. The cruelty of it was almost beyond comprehension. "Why would Doc Patterson do such a thing?" Jake asked, his loyalty to Boone making him angry on behalf of the family he'd watched suffer. "We may never know," Emma said, wiping her eyes and trying to regain her professional composure. "But what matters now is that we found each other, and we stopped Blackwood from hurting more children." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Cyrus Blackwood was led past them in shackles, his expensive clothes torn and his arrogant demeanor replaced by the bitter expression of a man whose empire was crumbling. Federal agents had been raiding his textile mills throughout the territory, liberating dozens of children who'd been forced into dangerous labor conditions. "This isn't over, Riker," Blackwood spat as he passed. "I have friends in high places, lawyers who'll—" "You have nothing," Emma cut him off coldly. We have 8 months of evidence, testimony from dozens of witnesses, and documentation of your illegal operations going back 3 years. Your friends in high places are about to discover they don't want to be associated with child trafficking." As Blackwood was loaded into a federal transport wagon, Rose tugged on Emma's sleeve. "Miss Agent Lady, Emma, what happens to all those other children? The ones in the mills?" Emma's expression softened as she looked at this brave little girl who'd helped expose Blackwood's crimes. "They're being taken somewhere safe, sweetheart. We have people who specialize in helping children find new families, good families who'll love them the way they deserve." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Judge Harrison, who'd ridden hard from Denver upon receiving word of the federal operation. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by obvious concern as he surveyed the damage and tried to understand the complex situation that had unfolded. "Boone, are you and the girls all right?" Harrison asked, dismounting quickly. "We're fine, Sam, but there have been some developments," Boone replied, gesturing toward Emma. "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Emma, the one I thought died 8 years ago." Judge Harrison's eyes widened as he took in the implications. "Good Lord. Agent Riker, I presume. We've been corresponding about the Blackwood investigation, but I had no idea of the personal connection." "Neither did I until 3 weeks ago," Emma admitted. "Judge Harrison, about the adoption proceedings for Rose, Lily, Violet, and Iris." "What about them?" Rose interrupted, sudden fear in her voice. "Pa, you're still going to adopt us, aren't you? Even though you have your real daughter back?" The question hit Boone like a physical blow. These 4 girls had already been abandoned once, and now they faced the terrifying possibility that finding his biological daughter meant losing their place in his heart. "Rose," Boone said firmly, kneeling down and taking all 4 girls into his arms. "You are my real daughters. Emma coming home doesn't change that. It just means our family got bigger instead of smaller." Emma watched the scene with tears in her eyes, understanding the profound bond that had formed between her father and these brave children. "Rose, Lily, Violet, Iris, I want you to know that I think you're the luckiest girls in the world to have my pa as your father, and I'm hoping you might be willing to share him with me." "You mean we'd be sisters?" Violet asked, her voice filled with wonder. "Real sisters, all of us together?" "If you'll have me," Emma said with a smile that transformed her serious federal agent demeanor back into the warm, loving girl Boone remembered. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, the Riker family stood together for the first time, 5 daughters and the man whose heart had room to love them all. But even as they celebrated this miracle of reunion, Emma's professional instincts remained alert. "Pa," she said quietly, "there's something else. Blackwood's operation was bigger than we initially thought. His arrest tonight might trigger retaliation from his business partners, people with enough money and influence to make trouble even for federal agents." The warning cast a shadow over their reunion, a reminder that justice often came at a price and that protecting the innocent sometimes required sacrifices from those who loved them most. "What kind of retaliation?" Boone asked, his protective instincts sharpening. "The kind that doesn't respect federal badges or legal documents," Emma replied grimly. "The kind that believes in silencing witnesses and eliminating problems permanently." The attack came at dawn, just as Emma had predicted. Boone was in the kitchen drinking coffee and watching his daughters, all 5 of them now, help Martha prepare breakfast when Jake burst through the front door, his face grim with urgency. "Boss, we got riders coming in fast from 3 directions. At least 20 men, maybe more, and they're not here for a social call." Emma was instantly alert, her federal training taking over as she moved to the window and assessed the situation through the early morning mist. What she saw confirmed her worst fears. Professional gunmen arranged in a coordinated assault pattern, designed to overwhelm any resistance and eliminate witnesses quickly. "Blackwood's business partners," she said grimly, checking her weapons. "They're not going to let us testify about what we've uncovered." Rose looked up from where she'd been helping Lily set the table, her young face serious but unafraid. "How bad is it, Emma?" The question demonstrated the courage that had impressed everyone who'd met these girls, but it also highlighted the terrible reality. Children who should be worried about schoolwork and games were instead facing life-or-death situations with the composure of seasoned adults. "Bad enough that we need to get you somewhere safe," Emma replied, her mind already calculating defensive positions and escape routes. "Pa, the root cellar." "No." Boone's voice carried absolute authority. "I won't hide my daughters in a hole while killers try to destroy our home. We fight, and we fight together." Emma started to protest, then saw the determination in her father's eyes and realized he was right. These men had come to murder children. Running would only delay the inevitable and leave them vulnerable during retreat. "All right," she said, shifting into command mode. "Jake, how many ranch hands can we count on?" 12 good men with rifles, plus myself and the boss. They're already taking positions around the house and outbuildings." "Not enough," Emma calculated grimly. "But it'll have to do." "Girls, I need you to understand something." "We know," Rose interrupted quietly. "Bad men are coming to hurt us, and we need to be brave. We've been brave before." This simple statement, delivered with such matter-of-fact courage, reminded everyone present why these children were worth protecting. They'd survived abandonment, poverty, and threats with their spirits intact. They deserved the chance to grow up safe and loved. "Martha," Boone said, "take the girls to the parlor. It's the most defensible room in the house, stone walls and limited approaches. Emma and I will—" "Pa," Rose said firmly, "we're staying with you." "Absolutely not. Your children and—" "We're your daughters," Violet corrected with surprising steel in her voice. "Daughters don't abandon their family when trouble comes." Before Boone could respond, the first gunshots cracked across the morning air. The attackers were testing their defenses, probing for weak spots while advancing under cover of the outbuildings and corrals. Emma positioned herself at the front window, her rifle ready as she counted muzzle flashes and calculated firing positions. "They're professionals," she reported. "Military training, coordinated movements. Someone paid serious money for this attack." A bullet splintered the window frame inches from her head, sending glass fragments across the floor. The girls ducked instinctively but didn't panic, their earlier experiences having taught them how to stay calm under pressure. "Emma," Boone called from the opposite window, "how much ammunition do you have?" "Enough for a sustained fight, but not enough for a siege," she replied honestly. "We need to break their assault before they can surround us completely." Outside, the attackers were using the barn and other structures as cover while they advanced on the main house. Jake's voice could be heard shouting orders to the ranch hands, coordinating a defense that was valiant but clearly outmatched. "Pa," Iris spoke up from where she crouched beside her sisters. "The tunnel." Boone looked at his youngest daughter with surprise. "What tunnel, sweetheart?" "Under the house," Rose explained quickly. "We found it when we were exploring. It goes from the cellar to the old well behind the garden. We thought you knew about it." Emma and Boone exchanged glances, both realizing that the girls might have discovered their salvation. If there really was a tunnel, it could provide an escape route or a way to flank the attackers. "Show me," Emma ordered, and Rose led them quickly to a hidden panel in the cellar that opened onto a narrow passage carved from the rocky foundation. The tunnel was crude but functional, probably dug by previous owners as protection during Indian raids years earlier. It emerged near an old stone well that was partially concealed by overgrown vegetation, perfect cover for a counterattack. "Jake," Boone called through the window. "Hold them as long as you can. We're—" going around behind them. As they prepared to enter the tunnel, Martha pressed a small cloth bundle into Emma's hands. "Your mother's jewelry," she said quietly. In case they need something to remember us by." The weight of the moment settled over them all as they prepared to risk everything for the chance to protect their family and expose the truth about Blackwood's criminal empire. The tunnel was barely wide enough for an adult, carved roughly from stone and earth decades earlier by desperate hands seeking protection. Emma led the way with her rifle, followed by Boone, and then the four girls, their breathing echoing softly in the confined space. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued to rattle the morning air as Jake and the ranch hands held their defensive positions. They emerged from the old well into a world transformed by violence. Smoke drifted across the ranch yard from a burning outbuilding, and the carefully maintained grounds were torn up by boot prints and scattered equipment. Through the haze, Emma could see the attackers' positions, professional killers using military tactics to systematically eliminate any witnesses to Blackwood's crimes. "There," she whispered, pointing to a cluster of men coordinating the assault from behind the barn. "Take out their command structure, and the rest will scatter." Boone studied the situation with the tactical experience of a man who'd survived frontier conflicts for decades. 6 men in the primary position, maybe 8 more spread between the corrals and the equipment shed. "But Emma, if we miss—" "We won't miss," Rose said quietly, her young voice carrying absolute certainty. "We can't. Too many people are counting on us." The wisdom and courage in his daughter's words reminded Boone of why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about their survival. It was about protecting other children who might face Blackwood's cruelty, about ensuring that justice prevailed over the corrupt power of wealth and violence. Emma positioned herself with a clear shot at the command group while Boone flanked toward the equipment shed. The girls were supposed to stay hidden near the well, but as the battle unfolded, they proved once again that the Riker family faced danger together. When Emma's first shot dropped the assault leader, chaos erupted among the attackers. Men who'd been advancing with professional coordination suddenly found themselves under fire from unexpected directions, their careful plans dissolving into confusion and panic. Violet, watching from the well, spotted movement that the adults had missed. "Emma, behind the water trough." Her warning came just in time. Emma spun and fired, stopping an assassin who'd been creeping toward Boone's position with a shotgun. The shot that would have killed her father instead went wide, splintering wood but leaving flesh unharmed. The tide of battle was turning, but the most dangerous moment came when the surviving attackers realized they were outflanked and surrounded. Desperate men with nothing to lose often made the most reckless choices, and these killers had been paid enough to know that failure meant death, regardless of who delivered it. "They're falling back toward the house," Boone called out, recognizing the tactical shift. "They're going after Martha and anyone else still inside." The realization sent ice through Emma's veins. These weren't soldiers retreating. They were killers choosing new targets, and Martha had stayed behind to maintain the illusion that the family was still trapped in the house. Rose made the decision that would define the rest of her life. Without hesitation, she broke from cover and ran toward the house, her sisters following despite Emma's shouted orders to stay hidden. They'd grown up protecting each other, and they wouldn't abandon Martha now. "Rose, no!" Boone's desperate cry echoed across the yard as he saw his daughters rushing into the line of fire. But Rose had seen something the adults missed, a wounded attacker crawling toward the kitchen door with a lit stick of dynamite, planning to destroy the house and everyone inside rather than admit failure to his employers. She reached him just as he prepared to throw the explosive, her small hands grasping his wrist with surprising strength. "You let go of that right now." The struggle lasted only seconds, but in those seconds, the fate of the Riker family hung in the balance. Lily and Violet grabbed the man's legs, while Iris kicked the dynamite away from the house, sending it rolling harmlessly toward the empty corral. Emma's rifle shot ended the threat permanently, but not before Rose had proven that courage wasn't about size or age. It was about standing up for the people you loved when they needed you most. As the explosion echoed across the valley, the surviving attackers broke completely, scattering toward their horses in full retreat. They'd come expecting to massacre a defenseless family, and instead found themselves outfought by federal agents, loyal ranch hands, and 4 children who refused to be victims. Martha emerged from the house with tears streaming down her face, her arms wide to embrace the girls who'd risked everything to save her. "You brave, beautiful children," she sobbed. "You wonderful, impossible, brave girls." In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of federal reinforcements that Emma had called for before the attack began. Justice was coming to finish what the Riker family had started, but the real victory had already been won. A broken man had learned to love again, lost children had found a home, and a separated family had been miraculously reunited. The yellow ribbon that Rose had kept through every trial was torn and dirty now, but she tied it carefully around Emma's wrist as they stood together in the aftermath of the battle. "Welcome home, sister," she said simply, and Emma knew that she truly was. 3 months later, the Riker ranch looked much the same as it always had, but everything had changed. The bullet holes in the barn had been repaired, the damaged outbuildings rebuilt, and the scars of battle erased from the physical landscape. The deeper healing, however, was still ongoing, a process measured not in construction and paint, but in laughter around the dinner table and the gradual relaxation of shoulders that had carried too much tension for too long. Boone stood on his front porch as the late afternoon sun painted the Montana Valley in shades of gold and amber, watching his daughters in the garden that Iris had transformed into something magical. Rose was teaching Emma how to braid a horse's mane, their heads bent together in concentration as they worked. Lily and Violet were helping Martha hang laundry, their cheerful chatter drifting across the yard like music. The yellow ribbon that had become their family talisman now flew from the porch railing, a banner of hope that had survived every trial. The legal proceedings had concluded 2 weeks ago, with Cyrus Blackwood receiving a life sentence for his crimes. More importantly, the federal investigation had led to the rescue of nearly 200 children from illegal labor operations throughout the territory. Many had been reunited with surviving family members, while others had been placed with good families who understood the precious gift of children who'd overcome unimaginable hardships. Judge Harrison had expedited the adoption papers, making it official that Rose, Lily, Violet, and Iris were legally and permanently Riker daughters. Emma had taken a leave of absence from federal service to help her sisters adjust to their new life and to reconnect with the father she'd thought lost forever. The badge and gun were stored away for now, replaced by the simpler tools of family life, garden implements, cooking utensils, and the worn pages of books she read aloud during evening story time. "Pa," Rose called from where she was working with the horses, "Emma says she wants to teach us to shoot properly. Is that all right with you?" Boone chuckled, remembering his surprise at discovering that his federal agent daughter was also an expert markswoman. "I reckon if you're going to live on a ranch in Montana, you ought to know how to handle firearms responsibly. But Emma, maybe start them with targets instead of dangerous criminals." "Already planned on it," Emma replied with a grin that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "Though given how these girls handled themselves during the attack, I think they're natural fighters." The memory of that terrible morning when assassins had tried to destroy their family was still vivid, but it no longer carried the sharp edge of trauma. Instead, it had become part of their story, the day when 4 orphaned girls and a broken man had stood together against evil and won not through violence, but through the unshakable strength of family bonds. Martha emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh biscuits and honey. Her maternal instincts now expanded to encompass 5 daughters instead of the solitary grief she'd shared with Boone for so many years. "Supper in an hour," she announced. "And Emma, your pa wants to show you something in his study before we eat." The study had been transformed as well, no longer a shrine to loss, but a celebration of family. Sarah's portrait still held place of honor above the fireplace, but now it was surrounded by newer images, photographs of all 5 girls, Emma's federal commendations, and Rose's first attempt at sketching the ranch. The silver locket that had once contained only memories of the dead now held pictures of the living, a reminder that love was meant to grow rather than simply endure. "I've been thinking," Boone said as he and Emma settled into the leather chairs by the window, "about the future, about what comes next for all of us." Emma studied her father's face, seeing contentment there that had been missing for 8 years. "What do you mean?" "Well, you're a federal agent with important work to do. The girls are going to need schooling, and Rose in particular has been asking about college. This ranch has been profitable, but it could be more. Maybe a place where other children who've been through what your sisters experienced could come to heal." The vision he was describing was ambitious, but not impossible. The Riker ranch had always been large enough to support multiple families, and their recent experiences had shown them how many children needed safe places to recover from trauma and discover their potential. "A refuge," Emma said thoughtfully. "A working ranch where kids could learn skills, gain confidence, and find families of their own." "Exactly. And you could continue your federal work from here, investigating cases while helping to build something that would make a difference for generations." Emma looked out at her sisters, seeing the transformation that love and stability had wrought in just a few short months. Rose was patient and nurturing with the animals. Lily had discovered a gift for cooking that brought joy to everyone around her. Violet devoured books and asked questions that challenged adults to think deeper, and Iris could coax life from the hardest ground with nothing but determination and care. "They'd be wonderful big sisters to other children who needed protection," Emma observed. As if sensing their conversation, Rose looked up from her work with the horses and waved, her smile bright enough to power the territorial capital. Around her wrist, the yellow ribbon fluttered in the evening breeze, no longer a symbol of loss and abandonment, but a banner of hope that had guided them all home. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples that seemed to promise infinite possibilities. Inside the ranch house, 5 daughters and the man who'd learned that love, multiplied rather than divided, were sitting down to supper, their voices blending in conversation and laughter that would echo through these walls for decades to come. Sometimes Boone reflected as he watched his family gather around the table. The deepest wounds become the places where the strongest healing grows. And sometimes, when you think you're saving someone else, you discover that you've been saved in return. The end.